Hello again and welcome to my hobby bench and another bearing video featuring Boca bearings. In today's video I will be demonstrating just the very basic techniques for bearing removal and installation, and I'll be showing just the small amount of tools necessary to get this job done. So with that said, let's go straight to the table. Okay, so here on the table I've got all the tools necessary to demonstrate bearing removal and installation in this engine. Now what I've got here is the crankcase of an OS 25 FSR engine with bearings currently installed and along with the crankshaft. Right here I've got a piece of hardwood. I just like a little piece of hardwood from a home improvement store to use as a drive to install the bearings. I've got a small hammer here to use to install the bearings, and then right here I've got tools used to both install and remove the bearings. And I won't be using all of these, but I just want to show you an example of some of the things that you can use to do this. Now one of the things is just a standard punch, flat nose punch that you can use to extract bearings if necessary. Same thing with this, it's a hardwood dowel, you can use that also. And I've got a short socket extension here, and I typically use this for assisting in driving in the bearing, the main bearing on the crankcase. So I also have a container here of Boca's Lightning Lube Road Power that I will use during bearing installation just to lightly coat the inside of the crankcase, surfaces where the bearings meet, and the outside edges or the outside of the races of the bearings. Now the theory behind removing and installing bearings is 99%, if not all, glow engine cases are made with an aluminum alloy or mostly aluminum. And of course the bearings themselves are steel, the races are steel. So aluminum has higher expansion and contraction coefficients and thermal properties than steel does. So in most applications, bearings are press fit into these, and sometimes you'll actually have an engine where the tolerances are such and the bearing tolerances are such that you can just kind of drop them in place. 90% of the time that's not how it works, and they're press fit. So what you'll do also is I have a heat gun and a vise here as a solid surface and heat resistant glove. So what I'm going to do is, what's required to remove these things is to heat up the case enough such that the aluminum expands and allows the bearing to come out, drop out, or be driven out safely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my glove on and I'm going to begin heating this case, and I'm going to be removing the rear bearing first. And I just so happen to have this piece of wood here to act as my surface to tap this case on. But if you can see here, this isn't flush. I've got the exhaust mounting thing, lug here, extends out beyond that. So fortunately my piece of wood here that I've got in the vise actually makes a nice little step there so I can tap that nice and firm. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just start heating up the case. Now the cases can be heated up using a variety of techniques. You can either use a heat gun, a hot plate, or if you have a small toaster oven, you can use that to heat the entire case up. I've always had very good success using my industrial strength heat gun. And if you have put any oil in here to help facilitate it coming out, you'll know when it's hot enough when you just start to lightly see that oil start to smoke. Now I didn't put any oil in here, so I may not see that. But that should be enough to get this bearing out. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to lightly tap it on the wood there, and the bearing just came right out. So let's see here. This front bearing should be warm enough here to just extract this too. So I'm going to see if this dowel is the right size to just go in there. And now for removing the front bearing, I'm just going to tap it here. And now that front bearing is out also. And that's really all there is to removal of bearings from these two-stroke engine. Now I'm going to allow this thing to cool before I demonstrate the installation. Okay, I believe this engine is still cooling down a little bit. The case is still cooling down, but I go ahead and start getting prepped here for the bearing installation. Now, one of the things I'm going to do here first is I've already squirted a little bit of this road power into this glass jar, and that's what I'm going to use to just lightly coat the mating surfaces of where these bearings is going to go. This will help facilitate the installation, and it's always a good thing to have some lubrication on there. I'm going to do the same thing with this crankcase, even though it is rather warm. It had some oil in there anyway, so I don't really need to do it again. The outer surfaces of the bearings, the outer races, I'll hit with some oil. I do not need to oil the innards of the bearings at all because A, they come pre-lubricated from Boca, and B, one of the major constituents of nitro fuel is oil, so it's going to get lubricated via the fuel. So I always install the front bearing first, and I'll explain why here momentarily, but I also go ahead when I'm going to do the rear bearing, I just slide that on the crankshaft, and I use this assembly to install the bearing. That way you just put it in there, and this rear bearing is fully supported by the end of the crank counterweight. And I put the front bearing in first so that when I go to install the rear bearing, it's already acting as a pre-centering mechanism going into the case, so you ensure that that bearing goes in straight. So what I'm going to do here is lightly heat this up just one more time, and we will get these bearings installed. Now, since this is aluminum, it transfers heat rather evenly. Even though I'm focusing my heat on the area where the bearings is, the entire case is getting heated up. That should be more than sufficient. I'm starting to see the oil smoke a little bit there. So I'm just going to set my front bearing in place, use my little piece of hardwood, and then just lightly tap that in place. And that bearing is fully seated. Now I'm going to remove this block, close my vise up some so that I can install that rear bearing. So I'm going to lay this in here nose down, just drop this in place. And here's where I'm going to use my socket extension as a drive, and then just tap that bearing in place. And see, it's fully seated, and the crankshaft is still, this is a new engine, so everything comes in and out very nicely. But that's all there is to installing the bearings in this very simple two-stroke engine. Now obviously there are different configurations of engines. You have some that have a front housing, a detachable front housing. Those are much easier to remove and install the bearings because you don't have to heat the entire crankshaft or crankcase up. You just remove the front housing, and the bearing usually is right there and it's easy to access. Obviously then you have four-stroke engines that have oftentimes, some four-stroke engines have up to 5 bearings in various locations, and in those instances you may actually have to use some other tools and techniques. And Boca sells a miniature bearing puller set, which is instrumental in removing some bearings in some applications, and I'd highly recommend getting that. But that is basically the nuts and bolts of removal and installing bearings in a very simple two-stroke glow engine.